Welcome. Today, we're cracking open the historical archives and stepping right back in time to 1888. Our goal in this explainer is to completely strip away over a century of myth, rumor, and, Hollywood sensationalism. Instead, we're taking a strictly evidence-based approach. We're relying entirely on verified historical records to examine the infamous Whitechapel case. Think of this like a cinematic documentary, but grounded purely in hard facts. So are you ready to see what the actual historical documents reveal about the hunt for a literal phantom? Let's get into it. More than 130 years later, the identity of Jack the Ripper remains one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. Just consider that quote for a second. Why, after all this time, does this specific cold case still completely captivate historians and forensic researchers alike? Well, what you should really take away from this is that the actual truth of what happened is far more fascinating than the ghost stories. We're going to strictly analyze the verified historical evidence, completely avoiding all that sensationalism, just to understand exactly how an unidentified suspect vanished right into history.
Welcome to Whitechapel, 1888.
Okay, let's dive into this. Just imagine walking down these streets for a moment. It's Victorian London. There's this thick fog, and flickering gas lamps are barely struggling to pierce through the gloom. You can practically hear the clattering of horse-drawn carriages in the distance. To truly understand this investigation, we absolutely have to look at the three main factors at play here: extreme poverty, rampant crime, and severe overcrowding. This wasn't just some spooky backdrop, right? This grim reality actively shielded the killer. The sheer density of people living in such desperate conditions meant that transient populations were just the norm. Crime was an everyday occurrence, making it incredibly difficult for the police to isolate the signal from the noise. It was, quite literally, a tragic, perfect storm. These severe social hardships created the exact environment for an opportunistic criminal to operate largely undetected in the shadows.
Part 2. The Canonical 5 Victims.
Now, we absolutely must shift our focus respectfully to the center of this tragedy, these 5 women. We're going to briefly honor their lives here, and we'll be strictly avoiding any graphic descriptions of the violence they suffered. These were real women, just struggling to survive in the incredibly harsh realities of 1888 Whitechapel. And their stories are the tragic core of this historical record. Now, taking a look at this timeline, I want you to notice the dates. They all occurred within this highly compressed window in the year 1888. Guiding you chronologically through this sequence is absolutely crucial because it really highlights the rapid escalation that completely overwhelmed local authorities. Just imagine being a citizen or a beat cop in Whitechapel as these events unfolded one after another in such a remarkably short period. The sheer pacing of these crimes within that single year is what ultimately triggered unprecedented citywide terror. Part 3. Origins of the name. So this brings up a huge question. If the police had absolutely no idea who they were looking for, how did the specific title end up permanently etched into history? We know the culprit was never definitively identified, never caught, and for sure never stood trial. So where did the infamous moniker actually come from? Well, now, what's really interesting about this slide is that the answer lies in a series of highly debated letters sent to authorities and news agencies. They claim to be straight from the killer, and the senders signed off with that infamous name. Now, to this very day, historical researchers and forensic experts still fiercely debate whether these letters were genuine communications from the culprit or if they were merely cruel hoaxes whipped up by journalists just trying to sell papers. But either way, the name stuck, and it fueled a massive global legend. Part 4. Panic and the Police. The combination of that brutal 1888 timeline we just looked at and those taunting letters led to absolute panic. It placed unprecedented pressure on the authorities. The public hysteria fundamentally changed London. Fear totally gripped the city, altering how people lived, worked, and walked the streets at night. The public was demanding immediate answers that the police were just completely ill-equipped to provide. And this brilliantly illustrates that exact impossible situation. On one side of our comparison here, we have Scotland Yard under the command of Inspector Frederick Aberline. They're working with incredibly limited, tangible evidence. Then, on the flip side, you have this massive public panic being actively driven by newspapers, publishing rumors, fear-mongering, and totally unverified claims. Poor Inspector Aberline was trying to conduct a methodical investigation while navigating a daily tidal wave of misinformation. The press essentially created an environment where the actual facts were completely buried by hysteria.
Part 5. The Biggest Mistakes.
So why did the case ultimately fail? Look, it's super easy for us today, sitting here with modern true crime analysis and massive DNA databases, to judge the investigators. But we have to look at the severe limitations they faced out in the field. So the crucial point is really breaking down these three massive challenges. First up, limited forensic science. They had zero DNA testing, no blood typing, and modern fingerprinting hadn't even been adopted yet. Second, witness reliability. Imagine trying to get an eyewitness account in an era of thick, volumetric fog, flickering gaslighting, and widespread panic. The accounts they did get were wildly contradictory and frankly unreliable. And finally, crime scene preservation. The concept was virtually non existent back then. Scenes were frequently trampled by crowds, reporters, and even beat cops well before the actual detectives arrived.
Part 6. An Unsolved Mystery.
As we wrap up this explainer, we have to confront the reality that this remains a profoundly unsolved mystery. It's really crucial to clearly distinguish the verified historical facts we've covered today. The dire conditions in Whitechapel, the reality of the canonical five, the origins of the letters, and those severe investigative limitations, from the centuries of wild, totally unproven theories that followed. The factual record ends with a cold trail and a deeply frustrated Scotland Yard, not with a neat, tied with a bow resolution. But it leaves us with one incredibly haunting final thought. Considering the thousands of people questioned, the heavy police presence, and the sheer density of Whitechapel, did investigators unknowingly interview the killer? Did Inspector Aberline or his men have the culprit sitting right in front of them, only to let him walk back out into the fog simply because of the limited forensic science of the era? It's a chilling historical question for sure, and it absolutely guarantees this case will continue to fascinate us for another 100 years.
Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving headfirst into the foggy, gaslit streets and historic police records of Victorian London. I want you to imagine stepping into the suffocating smog of 1888, where sheer fear gripped an entire city, and the modern concept of criminal investigation was still in its absolute infancy. We're here today to tackle one of history's most notorious questions. Was Jack the Ripper ever actually found? Let's break down the suspects, the science, and the enduring myths to see what the historic records really tell us. To figure out if the killer was ever truly caught, we've got to open up the original case file. Here's our game plan. We'll review the Whitechapel cold case, interrogate the prime suspects lineup, bring in some modern forensics, bust a few sensational myths, look at why this mystery endures, and finally, deliver the historical verdict. Let's get into it. Part 1. The Whitechapel cold case. Reopening the 1888 files. It's wild to think about, but the 1888 Whitechapel murders remain officially unsolved to this day. I mean, despite massive archives packed with old maps, crazy complex police records, and countless profiles built by desperate detectives, the killer who stalked those cobblestone streets just got away. Imagine trying to sleep back then, right? Knowing there's this shadow operating with total impunity right outside your door. Now, the police weren't just sitting on their hands. They cast a massive, unprecedented net across London. So who exactly was in their crosshairs? That brings us to part 2, the prime suspect lineup, interrogating the 1888 roster. Let's take a look at the first batch of major suspects. First up, Aaron Kosminski. He was a local resident struggling with severe mental illness, which, made him an incredibly easy target for police suspicion at the time. But if you actually dig into the records, there's absolutely zero proof of any violent tendencies. He was unwell, sure, but not necessarily dangerous. Then you've got Montague John Druitt. Now, the timing of his tragic suicide perfectly coincided with the sudden end of the murders. It's a really compelling coincidence. But modern historians point out he was likely physically incapable of committing the crimes, and he had basically no direct link to Whitechapel. Oh, and then there's George Chapman, a known serial killer. Sounds like a slam dunk, right? Well, until you realize he was a poisoner. His method of operation completely mismatched the sheer physical brutality of the Ripper. You can really see how the police were just grabbing at anyone who seemed even remotely suspicious. The Victorian police net was just incredibly wide, and they caught an extreme variety of people in it. On one hand, you have Michael Ostrog. He was a Russian con man and petty thief who, as researchers have pieced together, probably wasn't even in London during the murders. Then, completely on the other end of the spectrum, you have Francis Tumblety. He was this eccentric American quack doctor with well-documented deep-seated misogynistic tendencies who literally fled justice right as the investigation was peaking. These guys couldn't be more different, which really just goes to show how frantic and disorganized the authorities were in their desperate scramble for answers. So it all boils down to this one highly frustrating truth. No suspect has been confirmed as the killer by broad historical consensus. Despite all these compelling files and endless passionate debates over guys like Tumblety or Kosminski, modern historians agree that the Victorian evidence just does not hold up to a definitive conviction. The puzzle pieces from 1888 simply don't make a complete picture today.
Which naturally makes you wonder, could modern science catch a Victorian ghost? Part 3. Modern Forensics and Evidence. Science meets history.
Today, investigators are tackling this cold case through rigorous forensic reviews. We're talking about taking modern DNA testing, deep academic research, and psychological profiling, and applying it directly to century-old, compromised historical evidence. Sounds foolproof, right? I mean, we have tech the Victorians couldn't even fathom. If we can sequence genomes and use trace evidence to solve crimes from decades ago, you'd think we could finally unmask the killer and put this whole thing to rest.
But here is the harsh reality check. The immense power of modern science basically hits a brick wall when it goes up against history. Think about what detectives are actually working with here. First off, we're dealing with utterly compromised crime scenes from 1888. Preservation protocols? Yeah, those didn't exist. Officers literally washed away evidence to prevent public panic. Add to that over 130 years of contamination. Countless unprotected hands have touched these items, from police to journalists to museum curators. Then there's the tragedy of lost or destroyed original documents. Entire case files have just vanished into thin air. And finally, the severe limitations of degraded DNA make drawing any sort of scientifically sound conclusion today incredibly difficult. Science needs pristine data, and 1888 London left us anything but.
So, with the physical evidence in tatters, a massive void was left behind, and that void was very quickly filled by wild theories. Part 4. Sensational Myths and Conspiracies. Separating fact from fiction. It's the question that constantly pops up in pop culture, late-night documentaries, and movies. Was the killer actually hiding out in a royal palace? Were they protected by some shadow network or a secret society? Did the absolute highest echelons of Victorian society close ranks to protect one of their own from the hangman's noose? I mean, you have to admit, the idea is incredibly seductive. But when it comes to royal conspiracies, Freemason cover-ups, secret society protections, and all those other sensational media claims, the historical consensus is crystal clear. These theories remain entirely unproven and highly speculative. Look, they make for fantastic, highly entertaining fiction for sure, but academic researchers do not accept them as established historical fact. There is absolutely no tangible evidence to support a vast cover-up. The real story isn't some grand elite conspiracy orchestrated from a palace. It's honestly much more grounded in the grim, chaotic, and totally everyday reality of 1888 London. So if the prime suspects don't perfectly fit, and the elaborate conspiracies are just fiction, why is this case still open? Part 5. Why the mystery endures, the anatomy of a cold case. The incredible endurance of this cold case really comes down to a perfect storm of failures. It starts with the limits of Victorian policing. Their investigative tools were, well, primitive. No fingerprinting, no blood typing, no DNA. They relied heavily on unreliable eyewitnesses in pitch-black, foggy streets lit only by flickering gas lamps. Then, this severe limitation compounded over time into missing evidence. Crucial documents and physical items just quietly vanished from the archives over the decades. And finally, this massive gap in knowledge was aggressively filled by media influence. The sensationalist press of 1888 realized very quickly that fear sells newspapers. They permanently blurred fact and fiction, publishing fake letters and creating a mythological monster, rather than recording a factual crime scene. That triad, limited policing, lost evidence, and media frenzy, is exactly why this case stalled permanently. Which brings us to part 6, the final historical verdict. Was he ever found? The definitive answer from modern academic research is that the case remains officially unsolved. Despite all those suspect lineups we just reviewed, all the modern DNA analyses we tried to apply to compromised archives, and every single theory put forward over the last century, historians broadly agree that the killer's true identity is entirely uncertain. No single person has ever been officially confirmed guilty by the historical community. Which leaves us with a fascinating, almost haunting thought to explore as we wrap up. Does finding the killer's true identity even matter anymore? Or, after more than 130 years, has the mystery itself, the intense fascination, the media influence, the endless historical debates, and the entire true crime industry it spawned, Has that become the real historical artifact? It completely shifts how we view the past and what we choose to remember. Something to think about. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the Whitechapel files. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.